Segment 2, intellectuals and economics. We've already touched on this. 2 quotations. Number 1, Paul Krugman, quote, "Rising income inequality isn't new, but what happened under Bush was something entirely unprecedented. For the first time in our history, so much growth was being siphoned off to a small, wealthy minority that most Americans were failing to gain ground even during a time of economic growth," close quote. Second quotation, Dr. Thomas Sowell in Intellectuals and Society. Quote, "The statistics that the intelligentsia keeps citing are much more consistent with their vision of America than the statistics they keep ignoring," close quote.
That's a tough one to encapsulate, but the basic confusion is between statistical categories and flesh and blood people. It's true that if you look at the percentage of the income that went to the top 20% in some year A, and then later on, a decade later, you'll find that that percentage has gone up. And you say, well, that shows a disparity between the people.
The rich are getting richer.
The rich are getting richer.
Right.
But when you follow statistics generated by the Internal Revenue Service, which can follow particular individuals over time, you find that people who are in the bottom 20% of taxpayers in the first year, their income is nearly doubled by this later period, while the income of the people who are initially at the top is increased by less. And if you get down to the very top, it's actually going down. So that people are simply moving between these brackets from year to year. And the number of people who are in the bottom 20%, let's say in 1975, who are still there in 1991 is 5% of them.
Really?
29% of them have already gotten all the way to the top. An absolute majority are in the top half. And so you're comparing what happens to these abstract categories rather than what's happening to actual flesh and blood people.
So there's an enormous amount of churn and dynamism within the American.
Almost everybody's own personal life. I mean, look, what were you making when you were 20 years old compared to what you were making when you were 40?
Negative. I was spending my parents' money when I was 20 years old, right? All right? Okay. So why would the intellectuals, what you've just made is an intellectually rigorous case. Why would an intellectual, as you use the term, be loath to look at that intellectually rigorous argument, be loath to examine the data the way you did?
Well, he's happy with the data that he got. Well, why would he examine? Why would he go further? He looks at the numbers. The numbers say what he thinks it should say. Hey, that's it. Right. QED, and he moves on to the next great crusade.
Intellectuals in Society, once again. The very phrase income distribution is tendentious. Wealth can be created only after capital and labor have reconciled their competing claims and agreed to terms on which they can operate together in the production of wealth. Close quote. Income distribution, the very phrase is tendentious. How come?
Income is not distributed. Newspapers are distributed. Social Security checks are distributed. And one time, milk was distributed. Income is not distributed. People earn it directly from those to whom they provide some good or service. And the argument made by many people, you see, is that it's a question of capital and labor have conflicting interests in dividing up the income.
Right.
No. There is no income to divide up before they first reconcile their conflicting interests and decide on what terms they're going to produce that income. There is no there's no manna from heaven for them to fight over.
You make the point, what I'm coming to is the economic crisis that we went through 18 months ago. But we'll start with the Great Depression, where all discussions of economic crises should start, probably. And you make the point that there are two large features of the Great Depression. One was the stock market crash, and the other was the enormous government intervention, which began under Herbert Hoover and continued and expanded under FDR, but began quickly, in other words.
Yes.
And so you say, so you have two large facts here. It's a very good question, which actually caused or prolonged the Great Depression, and it's a question that very few intellectuals actually examine.
Well, one way of examining it would be to just look at the time period. The stock market crash occurred in October 1929. Now, there's data on unemployment month by month. 2 months after the stock market crash, unemployment peaked at 9%. It then began to decline irregularly till about 6.3% by June of 1930.
Indicating the economy was attempting to recover on its own. Right.
In June 1930, the government stepped in with its first massive intervention with a Smoot-Hawley tariff, passed despite a public appeal by more than 1,000 economists from the leading universities saying, don't do it. They did it anyway. It shows how much influence economists have. Within 6 months after that, unemployment hit double digits for the first time, and it never came down for the remainder of the decade, even for 1 month. And so the stock market crash brought you up to 9%, and that was starting to fizzle out. The government steps in to help, and that hits double digits, and it eventually got up to a peak of 25%, and it didn't fizzle out until the end of the decade.
All right. Listen to a list, and then I'll ask you a question. Chairman of the Fed, Benjamin Bernanke, B.A. at Harvard, Ph.D. at MIT, Professor of Economics at Princeton, Director of the National Economic Council, Lawrence Summers, undergraduate degree MIT, doctor at Harvard, youngest tenured professor of economics and Harvard history, eventually president of Harvard, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, A.B. Dartmouth, M.A. Johns Hopkins. He's the underperformer in the group. How did this group of intellectuals acquit themselves in handling the nation's economic crisis in 2008?
Well, first of all, they didn't handle it. The politicians handled it.
Ah.
And so even if you were to say that these guys really could have done a great job had they had the unbridled power and so forth, they don't have the unbridled power. One of the problems with experts is that experts are hired by other people. And so you never know what the expert would have done. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal some time back that what the policies that are being followed in Washington are the direct opposite of the policies that Summers advocated when he published before he got to Washington.
Right, right.
So we should never assume that experts are just people they're supplying information to politicians who are trying to do good.
So surely, though, the intellectuals had the notion that the government should step in is a hangover from the understanding of what took place during the New Deal, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so in other words, the intellectuals, the politicians are acting within a world of options that intellectuals have created over the decades.
Yes.
Right. And are you impressed by that, the intellectual framework?
No.
No. All right. All right.